listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
All right, welcome to a brand new episode of the Straight to Video podcast. These things seem non-stop right now, and I'm super glad you're enjoying them and coming back for more. I hope all is good with you lot out there and you're staying busy and healthy and all that stuff. On today's show, I'm speaking to someone who I really do consider one of the good guys. A couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure to have a chat with the wonderful Todd Kerns, who a lot of you may be familiar with as the bass player for Slash featuring Myles Kennedy and The Conspirators. That Slash guy from Guns N' Roses and Velvet Revolver. Todd is truly a force to be reckoned with when it comes to live performance and just really ticking all the boxes of being a great rock star. He grew up in a fairly remote part of Canada, which he tells us all about in the chat, and along with his brother John, he formed the bands Age of Electric and followed by Static in Stereo, who both gained a good deal of success in Canada and kind of like a worldwide cult following. I remember a good friend of mine telling me about these guys in the mid to late 90s and making me check them out. Todd would then go on to release a brilliant, and I mean it, solo album called Go Time, and then be part of the 20th anniversary lineup of Faster Pussycat. This led to him relocating to Las Vegas, where, along with Brent Muscat of Faster Pussycat, he would form the Sin City Sinners. They were just this great rock and roll cover band doing like residencies in Vegas with a ridiculous host of guest players. It wasn't long before Todd became a member of Slash's band, and since then he's never really looked back. It's been so cool to see this journey he's been on. One of the things we focus on in this chat is the band Toque, which Todd is part of along with his Slash bandmate Brent Fitz. And it's like this perfect accompaniment to what the Straight to Video podcast is trying to shine a light on. What Toque essentially is, it's this band that focus on doing amazing cover versions from lesser known Canadian rock bands, all from like the late 70s to mid 80s. Some stuff you might know like Rush or Loverboy, but then there's songs by people like Queen City Kids and Aldo Nova, who a lot of people perhaps have never heard of. What they deliver is something really amazing, and it's so cool how they bring some new energy and focus on songs which really shape them into who they are today, and it also brings attention to bands which people would perhaps have never heard of. It really is this wonderful musical tribute. One added bonus of their new album though is an original song called Never Enough, which I mentioned to Todd as genuinely being one of the best modern hard rock songs I've heard in a long time. I'm a hard rock kid, but it's not very often I hear a new band put something out which has the feel and buzz of the stuff I grew up on without sounding forced or dated. Never Enough. Well, damn. It's just so good. I'll end the chat with the full version of the song so you can see what I'm talking about. Please dive in and get on the Toque train by hitting them up at toquerocks.ca. That's Toque, spelled T-O-Q-U-E, rocks.ca, or on all the main social media sites at Toque Rocks. Todd himself can be found at toddkerns.com, on Twitter at todd-kerns, or on Instagram at toddkerns. Tell him we sent you. So sit back and enjoy my chat with, like I say, one of the good guys, Todd Kerns. I'm going to throw things right back, and if my knowledge is correct, or at least Wikipedia is correct, you were born in a place called, I'm going to pronounce it right, Estevan, Saskatchewan?
That's very good.
Yeah, is that all right?
That's very good pronunciation. The funny thing is I was born there, but we moved right away. I don't even really understand this. I mean, maybe they were on the run from the law or something. I'm not sure what maybe some like train robbers. That'd be a better story. I should really kind of
flesh that out.
Yeah. Put it on Wikipedia. We eventually ended up in northern Manitoba in Canada. When I talk about it, it's like I say, in northern Canada. It was freezing cold. It was like, the summers there was like freezing cold and then mosquitoes were the two, but it was an awesome place to grow up, lakes and that whole thing. And so I spent half my childhood there. And then I went back to Saskatchewan for high school. But in northern Manitoba, where I grew up, whenever I talk about it's really far north. And then you look at a map, because Canada is so vast, all the living is sort of perpetuated on the basically just north of the United States border. You know what I mean? So we were kind of like, it was north, but it's still like a considerable amount of the country still keeps going.
Okay.
But it was north enough. I don't want to be any more north than that, So I grew up in that. We moved back to Saskatchewan, which is also like the Midwest in the States. I'm not sure it's hard to associate that with England, because you guys have such a different, you have your own sort of weather and sort of stuff. But Canada's, generally known to be, where I grew up was a lot of snow, a lot of cold, a lot of hockey, ice hockey. And I kind of fell more into although I did play ice hockey because it was the law as a child in Canada. You just you either did that or you picked up a guitar. And that's what we did. Essentially. Yeah.
So was it a fairly big place where you grew up, or what was like the nearest hub or city? Was it a city within itself?
No. Basically in northern Manitoba, when I grew up there in a town called Lynn Lake, it was very remote, and It was its own thing. And I think the next town was 90 minutes away. And,
wow.
and the next bigger centers were, at its peak, it was apparently 3,000 people. I was actually quite surprised to read these stats recently, but it was like one of those places where a nickel mine had opened. And I guess there was a flurry of humans that moved up there, had this whole thing. And I always was under the impression that it was about 1,500 people, because of the town we moved to back in Saskatchewan was about 1,500 people. But these are towns that didn't have a 7-Eleven or streetlights or a McDonald's or anything like that. But in Saskatchewan, we moved back to Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan was a big city. It was not by any stretch of the imagination, is it a big city? But for us, it was a big city. I could get a Slurpee there, you could go to rock concerts, bands would actually come through there and stuff like that. So by that point, being a teenager, it was the perfect time to go back, to have this experience of being able to kind of, grow up in a small town, and then drive an hour to the city and have that experience. Go to a shopping mall.
Right.
Oh, wow, there's that whole thing. So, but I think it probably really shapes who you are, because not only am I Canadian, but I'm also small town Canadian. So there's a real sort of like where I grew up. It was like I remember my friends would come to visit sometimes when we put together our band called The Age of Electric. My brother and I were from Lanigan, and the other two were from a town called Regina, which was a city. And they would come, and because we put the band together in Lanigan, because we thought, well, we could probably rent a room or something like that and just jam. That'll be cheap. We'd get up in the morning and take a walk to the local, restaurant or something like that. And as you walk by, the old timers will be like, "Morning, how are you?" As you walk by, and those guys would be like, "Do you know that guy?" I go, "No."
It's just what we do.
Yeah, just what you do in a small town. It's like, "Good morning, hello, how are you?"
Yeah.
My father will engage, like the guy comes over here to, check the gas tank or something in the house, and my dad will be following him around having an extended conversation. He'll come back and report to me how he's this great dude, and he's from Arizona originally. I'm like, okay.
My dad lives in America, in Mississippi.
That's right, yeah.
I always love it where people just drive by and just wave as they go by and stuff like that. It's great.
That's exactly it. There was a thing in Saskatchewan where you'd be driving like this, and there'd be like a steering wheel wave, like kind of a, hey, as you're driving, like, hey, and you're driving by, and everybody's like, "Do you know that guy?" "No, we just live in the same town." And
that's it. That's enough.
Probably aware of him, or I know his brother, or or something like that.
So where did the exposure to music come from?
Well, that's funny, because in growing up in like this remote, like as a child, it was like it's a weird one to consider, because basically just finding music, my parents' record collection and stuff like that. There was the Beatles and Elvis, and my dad had a lot of the Johnny Cash and the outlaw country stuff. But I think it was it is funny to imagine that even as remote as that is, it still filters in. Like the music is still you're still aware of it. You know what I mean? And going to the local pharmacy and looking at magazines and finding guitar magazines and rock and roll magazines and stuff like that. It was enough of an education, although I was probably getting stuff like carbon copies of carbon copies, and perhaps like a little later than the rest of the world would be receiving this information. And I talk about this a lot because I've been having these conversations with a lot of my friends about growing up, how finding music was interesting back when we were kids, because you never saw any of your heroes in any sort of three-dimensional form. You only sort of saw them kiss or something on an album cover, and you just looked at it and listened to the music. So if something like Solid Gold came on, or say before that, like Don Kirshner's rock concert or the Midnight Special, we'd sit and watch whatever it was. Todd Rundgren's Utopia or Seals and Croft. It didn't matter who it was. I was just always fascinated by the idea of like just watching somebody play music. And my father was always a big lover of music. Both my parents are musical. My dad is more like the 3-chord, have a couple drinks and sing cowboy songs guy. And my mom played a bit of piano, but it wasn't a massive focus. And then my dad owned this old Harmony with the F-holes, an acoustic guitar. And I used to put it on and pretend I was Elvis or something. As a child, it's like funny because, you don't have the discerning idea of what's cool and what's not cool. Your mom has an ABBA cassette in the car or whatever she listens to. And you love all of it, Bay City Rollers was like very early for us. It was kind of like, that was a massive Beatlemania type thing in Canada. The Bay City Rollers had this real moment. I was just a child, but I think I had an aunt or something like that who was into that. And then, meeting friends, and they had older brothers, older siblings. I remember looking through their album covers or album collection, and it would always be, it seemed like every older person always had Frampton Comes Alive, Rumors, probably something like Toys in the Attic, $1 Billion Babies, like just like the cream of the crop of like 70s rock, and you'd go through them and you'd listen and you go, that's okay. Then you put on Alice Cooper and go, damn, what is this? Or Aerosmith and stuff like that, and you really started to get this education regardless of how bizarre it was. Because as a kid and like anybody else, you like what you like and you just kind of don't pay attention to what you don't really like, or not that you don't like it. It's just more like, nah, it's not for you, and then from there, it's kind of like my dad got annoyed with me running around with the guitar and just said, this is a C chord. That's a D chord. Yeah, that's a G chord. I go, okay. And, that was very challenging, like really, but then we had like a few friends picked up the guitar and, next thing you know, you're bashing around some ideas. Yeah. And this is in that small town in Northern Canada. And eventually we get some electric guitars, and then somebody's got a drum kit and then we're jamming over at his house and just making a horrible racket. I can't believe the patience of parents of these people. Because you meet young people now with these School of Rock programs and all that stuff. Yeah. There are like 14-year-olds who are like, they're ready to go. Like they're ready to get on stage.
That's scary.
And 9-year-olds who are like genuinely talented, And we were just like hacking away. Like no one was teaching you how to play Deep Purple or Stairway to Heaven or any of that kind of stuff back then. It was all like, no. Here's, some sort of like campfire sing-along type songs and whatnot. And there's merit to learning these kind of like very simple things. But I mean, we all want to run. Nobody wants to walk. So, but eventually you're just making a bunch of racket with friends and you're coming up with band names and all that kind of stuff. By the time I moved back to the next city, there was a little bit more, it seemed like everybody played an instrument. Like it feels like to me, like even in a small town like that, like tons of guys played. I was very young. My father, in his wisdom, somewhere along the way, he bought me an Epiphone acoustic, which is a very common first acoustic guitar to have. And then right away he goes, not right away, but at some point he decided, well, you got a guitar, we should get you a bass guitar. Like what a bizarre, like he never thought like, let's get an electric guitar, or let's get a bass guitar. So we go into the shop and we come home with this Gibson EB3, which I still have. And that carries a lot of weight. I could barely play it, but the fact that I had something that said Gibson on it was a big deal. So when I was in high school and I just met this guy and his brother had a band and they were looking for a bass player. And I was like, okay. And they were all out of high school. That was the weird thing, is all these guys are out of high school. I can barely play, but they're like, perfect, come in, play here.
We need a bass player. Everyone needs a bass player.
Back then, especially, it didn't seem like, this is before, like, I don't know, Steve Harris or Nikki Sixx made it cool to be a bass player, or Sting for that matter, or and I think that it was sort of like the next thing I know, back then where I grew up, there was a whole circuit of playing high school dances, which is probably bizarre. It's probably all DJs now, I assume. Yeah, we would go like Fridays and Saturdays, we would just kind of like drive out to some town and play at a high school dance. And then on a Saturday, there'd be some sort of like town hall type party in another town. And so when people talk about their high school jobs, like bagging groceries or something like that, I was doing that, So for years, I just did that. That was law. There was a singer and I was just a bass player. I would have done that my whole life. I would have been happy just to be the bass player quietly in the background, or not even quietly. I was bouncing around like an idiot, but that was just like, I had achieved everything I was looking for.
You've got two brothers, right?
Yes.
Was it always a musical thing between the three of you? Because you all went into music.
Yeah, not originally, actually. I sort of like, my next youngest brother is about barely 2 years younger than me, I think. Well, actually, no, he's probably, we're about 2 years apart. weren't. Then my next youngest brother is 3 years after him. So it starts to get kind of like there's a distance between he and I, at least when we were younger. Like he was just a little kid, you know what I mean?
Gotcha.
So at first, as I got older, I started like all that, what I was talking about. That band I was playing in as a kid playing high school dances went from a 5-piece and pared down to a 3-piece, and I became the singer. So it was this weird sort of like, let Todd sing one, let Todd sing another one. Hey, Todd, sing all these songs. And I was kind of like, and it's sort of like you go, okay, you know, there's almost a responsibility it's way more responsibility than you want just to go play shows and party and chase girls and that whole thing. Next thing you know, you're like, now you got to take care of yourself because your voice is this and that. And you don't realize that until you've blown it out a couple times.
So how old was you around this time? Would you be like mid-teens or?
15, 16 by this point. So we put together, but by that point, as soon as high school was over, we started touring around in Canada, which at that time, and I've had a lot of conversations with friends about this too, because at a specific time around the 80s that you could play 6 nights a week, different places around Canada, just, you know, and generally in places that I didn't think anybody really wanted to actually see us, you know, these little oil towns and like guys who were like, you know, living in an oil town, just making money until they could go home when the season was over, I guess. And it just seemed like, you know, but I call it the Hamburg years, like when the Beatles went to Hamburg and they played, because we played cover songs. It was what we did. We just played cover songs 3 sets a night, sometimes 4 sets a night.
Wow.
Monday to Saturday.
Proper got to look after your voice then if you're doing that.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And it was really a big, huge learning curve because you're young and you're like, woo, you know, we're going to party. And you're like, it's like Monday or like Wednesday, dude, chill out. It's like, well, you know, I had achieved the dream. We were broke. We weren't making a lot of money. In the early days, it wasn't a lot of money. It was sort of, you know, but I was like, I have achieved the whole thing. If this is the way it goes, I'm happy as a clam, you know?
Yeah.
I then eventually that band kind of splits up and you know, some other band hires me, another band hires me. And, you know, the money's, you know, for a kid, it was great. But it wasn't until later when I put together the Age of Electric that my younger brother, John, was at home with a bass that I'd left behind and became way better bass player than I am, frankly.
Yeah.
You know, it was decided that I'd met the drummer for the Age of Electric, Kurt Dahl, who started working for my band at one point as a roadie, essentially. He was like one of my favorite people on the planet. We just connected. And he was a drummer and his little brother played guitar. And I said, it'd be really cool is if you get you and your brother, me and my brother, we'll put a band together. And that's basically what we did. And that lasted for 10 years. You know, we went on to record and tour and make records and get a gold album and all that stuff, you know. So
when you was like getting serious or at least gigging regular with the bands, who was you kind of, I don't want to say emulating or pretending to be, but who was you kind of, did you have like an influence? I mean, obviously Kiss have been a big influence to you, but who was you kind of looking up to?
My influences are largely the exact same today. Bands like Kiss and Cheap Trick and Guns N' Roses too. I mean, you know, it's like, I mean, Guns N' Roses was later, but I mean, in those early days, definitely Kiss, you know, we all had an affinity for that kind of just guitar rock and the showmanship of it all, you know, just the kind of the fun of it, you know, and, you know, we kind of chased all that down and, you know, and it was kind of part of the fun was learning those cover songs. So you kind of learn the arrangements of songs, you know, you kind of, okay, so intro and a verse and, you know, so when it came down time to start writing songs, it was kind of like, oh, okay, that seems to make sense.
So what kind of bands came through your area? Were they like the big American touring bands?
A lot of Canadian stuff, like this band I put together called Toque with Brent Fitz from Slash's band and Corey Churko from Kelly Clarkson and our friend Shane, who's played with a bunch of people. That whole thing is largely based on this love of Canadian music that we grew up on, which is all bizarrely regional and some stuff you've never heard of. But there are bands like Loverboy and Rush, April Wine you might have heard of. There's a lot of these acts that, you know, they were like gods in our. So when you grow up it's probably the same as growing up. It's different in England. I was going to say in England, because of course there's massive, but there are groups that are sort of essentially popular in England or even maybe, you know, popular in your region that are not, they don't really translate elsewhere. So for us, it was kind of like, it didn't really make a difference to us if a band was from America or England or Canada. They were on the radio and they were successful. And so it's all part of that thing goes into the same pie we're making is all these different influences. So a lot of that, like Loverboy with Bryan Adams opening. A young Bryan Adams was the opening act was my very first concert in '83. I was just a kid, you know, but then like Kiss came through, Judas Priest came through, you know, all that metal thing that came up later on.
What Kiss tour was it? Or did you see them a few times?
I saw them on Animalize. So I saw them on Animalize in '85, I guess it was.
Yeah.
And Bruce Kulick was the guitar player. And now I play with Bruce very regularly. and Judas Priest on Defenders of the Faith. And, all that heavy metal thing started to happen, and that was a big thing. Wasp with Crocus, like all that stuff. But the funny thing about it is even from a very early age, I saw the concerts I saw, but I eventually started playing in a band, and I never really got to see concerts for a long time. I was saying to somebody,
right,
and I remember saying, like, just hitting this realization, I don't think I ever saw Alice Cooper live until like maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah.
It was like a very strange thing to have like a favorite, artist like that and never have a chance to see them because I was always playing. Even Kiss, I saw them in 85, and I never really saw them again until the reunion tour 10 years later, 11 years later, because I was always playing, always touring, always doing stuff. So it's sort of like, it was a good trade-off as far as I was concerned.
The good thing with Alice is he's still as good as he ever was. That's
exactly.
one bonus.
And he's fairly timeless that way too. Like even, he seems the same every year you see him. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So you had the band Age of Electric from, if I get this right again, 89 to 2000. At what point did things begin to take off and gain traction? And you being a hard rock kid, I don't know if the rest of the band were from the same thing, and releasing music throughout the 90s, how did you find that musical climate? Because you were very original sounding and sounded of that time. Was you just a product of what was happening around then?
I think, it's funny because, we all grew up on hard rock and roll and all that kind of stuff. But we also always had a foot in pop. The guys always loved things. We always were very diverse in our tastes of music too. You grow up, you grow your hair long, you wear tight pants, you play loud guitar rock and roll. And, as the 90s started to approach, it's almost like, when we talk about this conversation is always interesting to me because it's almost as if the 90s came along and just clubbed the 80s like it was a baby seal. And I always go, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think that the 80s was a victim of itself in its own way. Like it was almost like when I think back, I'm trying to think like, there was some great stuff that got squashed, but unfortunately there was a lot of, those seeds were being sown very early on, even with things like Jane's Addiction, bands like that who were kind of like uncategorizable at that time. Like we weren't really sure, like, what do you call this? It didn't seem like what was going on. And so I think in a lot of ways, bands like that deserve more credit than they get, because I think there was sort of an awakening going on where people were starting to look in other directions, and so all that stuff that was bubbling up in places like Seattle, Mother Love Bone and acts like that, they were already interesting to us. So by the time we had started to kind of like had this metamorphosis ourselves, was sort of this, it's hard to call it maturing because we were like 22,
You were probably young enough to still get excited about this new stuff that was coming in. Like, holy shit, what's this? This is great. I've not heard anything like this before.
No, and that's exactly it. I think, but we did, because we love bands like the Pixies and we love all this stuff. And the cool thing about being from a small town like I was from was this sort of like, it wasn't until later on that people started to draw lines like, oh, you're allowed to like this, but not that. Or like, but when we were kids, it was sort of like, I could find things like The Clash and fall in love with punk rock but then all of a sudden, and still love Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, you know what I mean? Like I loved so many different things. And I'd be like, I love this ABBA song, or whatever it was. It was just kind of like this weird sort of hodgepodge of like, you can like what you like. And if it wasn't even so much that you didn't like something as much as it just didn't grab me. And I just kind of went on with my day, you know what I mean? And then later on, especially with my punk rock friends, it was like, no. It was kind of like, these are the four major food groups of which I fell madly in love with: the Stooges and the New York Dolls and the Ramones, of course. All that stuff, was 100% up my alley. But I kind of always felt like it were just different food groups that we could all enjoy all this stuff, And I have a lot of friends who feel the same way. When you grow up in a bigger city, it's a lot more like, you look like this. Punk rock kids look like punk rock kids, and the rock and roll kids look like rock, or heavy metal kids look like this. And we just kind of like never really thought about it. It was like, so as the music started to kind of evolve, it was already, they talk about Nirvana like it was like Monday it was this and Tuesday it was that. It was sort of like, in living it in real time, it was sort of like Nirvana was already around. Bleach was already a thing. And those of us that were kind of aware were sort of like, yeah, we love this stuff. This is great. This is really cool. And, fashions change. They're changing today. It's constantly evolving. And as, the pants got looser and the hair got shorter, it's just kind of like what happens, And so Age of Electric was just sort of like what seemed like probably like one day we were just a totally different band. is because we kind of were a totally different band in a way. Like we had built this entire following all these years playing clubs, and then we moved to Vancouver, which made a big difference too, because Vancouver, Canada is a very big city and a major center, and it was really close to Seattle. So there's this whole transition of, from cowboy boots to Doc Martens and, that kind of thing. The leather jackets generally hung around.
Yeah.
And actually long hair hung around a lot longer than people remember. Because, when Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Alice in Chains were around, they were just all like, to me, they all just looked like guys from rock bands who, play a slightly different kind of music. It didn't, it wasn't radically different. These were still guys. It's not as radically different as having the conversation now of like, like I talk to young people now and they say, just the other day, I talked to a friend of mine and she was like, I didn't really find anybody to play with in high school because no one really listened to rock and roll. And it's like a weird thing to consider that like in the 21st century, it's like playing guitar is almost kind of, it's like, what are you, a jazz musician or something? Yeah. It's almost become kind of bizarre that way. So to us, it was like, it's not like looking at Pearl Jam versus who I always kind of felt, they kind of had more a harken back to like a 70s kind of rock band in a way. And Soundgarden and Alice in Chains in a lot of ways was a very gradual metamorphosis from the heavier music. They were still heavy. Like Soundgarden is a heavy band. There was still the heavy stuff around. Slayer and all that stuff was still around. It just kind of like the glitter rock. Oh, I still call it glitter rock. I like the 70s term more than the hair metal. I never really liked that term, but glam rock, we called it. It definitely became sort of passé. And that, unfortunately is what happens when things shift gear. And, so we were all those kids. We had long hair and we loved the Cult and we had pirate shirts, we were on to do the whole thing. And then it was like, if you're a kid, you just love that stuff. And then you just kind of sort of quietly shift over to a different thing. And that's basically what happened. So by the time Age of Electric was up and running and got signed, we had already kind of like found ourselves kind of acclimating to this whole new thing. And then in the songwriting aspect, and, it sort of went away from, although if you listen to Age of Electric, there's a lot of guitar solos. It sort of had started to kind of veer away from like guitar solos aren't cool now, which I always thought was kind of very silly. And we never really took it that seriously. We always thought it was really funny that people kind of became like, oh, I never listened to Motley Crue. I go, what? We were together. Yeah. We listened to Shout at the Devil every day. I remember you listening. We all knew that we loved, all that stuff, and it was still a part of us. We just kind of like, it was just part of your heritage, and you just kind of grew into this other thing. So when the transition comes back again, Age of Electric, we were together. We were only together till 98, actually.
Right.
So about, almost 10 years, basically. And, a lot of ground was covered in that time. So we basically, we got signed out of New York City. We had management out of New York City. And we were a bunch of Canadian kids from the prairies. So just the little hick kids who...
How did someone in New York hear? Was it through radio or?
The reason we moved to Vancouver was because we used to play across the country, which is a whole epic journey, by the way. Towns aren't close together in Canada. Canada is massive. It just goes on and on. So we eventually made our way to Vancouver and started playing shows and built a following there. And Bob Rock, who had produced Metallica and Motley Crue by this point, and a bunch of other stuff at this point, goes, I love you guys. I want to record you guys. I want to, let's, we were all like, us? Like, we had basically been living on the road, like no fixed address. None of us really had homes. We just we'd kind of been living in this sort of cover band world of we made our living doing these week-long gigs, which in and of itself was starting to evaporate too, as part of the 90s changed that whole thing too. So we said, let's just move to Vancouver and become a real band in a sense, not be playing cover tunes. And we were playing cover tunes, but we were writing our own songs. And the cool thing about our band was that we got to a point where we would go from playing 3 sets of cover tunes to suddenly playing largely our own music, because we'd built up enough of a following and where people were like, we don't want to hear whatever your, song you're playing, play your own stuff. And we eventually, okay. So we just built this whole thing and we're releasing independent music. And then the move to Vancouver was sort of like the big leagues. And Bob was working on Keep the Faith by Bon Jovi at that time.
Right.
So that's a big transition for Bon Jovi. Remember the haircut and this 90s thing. And now I know Hugh McDonald very well, the bass player for Bon Jovi. And he was on that record. He was on a lot of the records, even the ones when he wasn't in the band. But so we were recording at Little Mountain Sound, and Bruce Fairbairn was working on Get a Grip with Aerosmith, and Bob was doing Keep the Faith. But Bob was like, we were in a corner, like this little tiny corner studio. So he would come over and like, that's cool, da-da-da-da, and he'd run back to Bon Jovi. And his engineer was there, kind of like, we were just basically these nut jobs. So we built this whole new life for ourselves. And the band's transition was already occurring. Like the band was, I don't know what year, 92? I don't know. Yeah, it's something like that, 92, 93. So things were, evolving, and things had become what they became. And so through all this, we got to know Richie Sambora, and Richie Sambora had a manager out of New York, and that manager worked for Michael Jackson's management company, and we flew out to New York City and met him. And long story short, that particular thing didn't work out, which was weird. Like, we kind of like Bob's whole thing, that whole rah, we're going to make this work, didn't really work. Like no one signed us and no one seemed to care. So we just said, okay, fuck it. We'll just put it out ourselves. We released it as an independent EP, the Ugly EP. We had a single called Ugly, and that became a hit. And it led to us making a full-length record in 95. We kind of used this song that was already kind of like a radio hit and put it on our full-length as well, and said, now here's the full-length. And that was, by this point, we started to have this other New York connection turned into another New York connection. And we had management out of there that eventually led to getting signed to Mercury Records out of the United States, out of New York. And they eventually led to the 97 record, our final record, which is weird. We did all this climbing and scratching and clawing. And then we finally got there, and it was just like, it just kind of like was kind of not working in a way. It's funny, at the beginning of the band, you started talking about this transition from the 80s to the 90s. In the end of the band, it's the transition from the 90s into the 2000s, where there's a whole other shift. And that shift is about not selling records anymore, and a whole shift in that way. So it's really interesting that we kind of existed in this really sort of creamy area where everything was the perfect time to be doing it. We had this whole experience where we made this record, the final record we made out of New York. How did that work? We recorded the album. Then there was a shift in the president. This is always the classic record company story. We'd finished the record, but they changed the president of the company. And as those things happen, they go, oh, I don't want any of this. So, but we were like in our own, I don't even know what we were thinking, but we had this thing of like, look, we have a thing going in Canada, our own thing going on, and we make our own records, and we had our little label that we did. And we said, we want to keep Canada independent, like our own. You guys can have the rest of the world. So when the deal fell through with the United States, because to them, I think they thought Canada, yeah, you can have that. It's the population of New York State or something, or New York City. I don't even know. So they were kind of like, yeah, that's fine. So when that went away, we had the rights to the album to just
That's quite smart, really.
It's surprisingly like intelligent for young idiots. But we were working with Universal out of Canada. We'd been involved with them for a long time. And it was basically like, here's a full record already made, and they just kind of ran it up the flagpole. And that one went gold, and we did really well. And we should have, in retrospect, well, we all feel this way. Because it's funny when you're clawing and scratching and trying to get something going on that everybody is just, you're a fist. It's when success starts to happen that people start to kind of grow apart. You know? And it was a weird thing to be it just kind of faded away. We got nominated for a Juno Award, which is like a Canadian Grammy. And the record company gets us a limousine, and we're like, we don't ride in limousines. And we're all riding over to this event, and I'm like, and we aren't even a band anymore by this point. Like we literally aren't even playing together. And it was this weird thing, and we didn't win it. And after at the party, they gave us these gold albums. You guys went gold. And it was this really surreal.
That's got to be weird.
It's very strange because it's like, it was kind of like, I guess it'd be like finding out you're having a kid, but you're not with this person anymore. You know what I mean? So it was like, it was very bizarre. So, and from there, I went on and did like production stuff and solo stuff, and which eventually led me to where I am now in the States.
So you're working on Toque. Is it like the second album which you've just released? Was it last year, the second album?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
You mentioned earlier it's essentially you guys covering lesser known Canadian acts to perhaps the rest of the world, which Absolutely. In turn, due to your popularity, it's bringing them attention to a wider audience. Was that something you planned or just a nice added bonus?
It's such a weird thing because, I remember being in a car with Corey Churko, the guitar player. He plays in Shania Twain's band, and Kelly Clarkson and Reba McEntire. He plays with all these people. And he's from where I grew up, around the area I grew up, and we've known each other since we were teenagers, and we're very close. And he's the godfather to one of my kids. Anyway, we're driving around in a car in Hollywood, and he's listening to like this band from like our hometown. That only. And I just remember like sitting in the car and looking out the window and going, nobody around us has ever heard this song before, and we love this song. It was this really bizarre thing of like, we thought, wouldn't it be cool to record these songs and to show people how rad these songs are, but they've never heard them before. We ended up, a couple of charity events came up in Canada where Fitz had they had a breast cancer charity show they wanted a band for. Will you guys come play? And yeah, sure. And then we just got the idea. I think Brent's idea was like, let's just play Canadian music, because we're playing in Winnipeg, Canada, the most Canadian place in the world. And we were like, okay, it's an interesting challenge, and it's fun, and it's very like apropos to go there and just go, boom, here we are playing all this music that's very specific to that audience. It's funny because a friend of these friends of ours, this is like last year or something like that, the crew for Iron Maiden was playing in Winnipeg, and we were playing there last year. So these crew guys that we know who had worked for Slash in other ways, they came to the show just because they were on that night off. They came to see us play Toque, and they were like, it was like being a part of some cult meeting that you don't know, that you're not involved in. Because he goes, everybody's singing all the words, and I've never heard any of these songs before. And I go, I know, dude. It's like, it's got to be so weird. Sure, once in a while, Working for the Weekend or something like that comes up, or some Tom Sawyer by Rush or something like that. But largely, it's just like this totally over your head experience. And I was like, I know, dude. It's so bizarre, but that's kind of what happened. And Corey is an amazing producer. His brother is Kevin Churko, who produces like Five Finger Death Punch and In This Moment and all these bands. A very talented family. So anyway, Corey starts to toy around with the idea and starts coming up with tracks and whatnot. And then I go over and I'm like, oh wow, okay, cool. I start singing on it, and Fitz starts playing on it. And in a bizarre turn of events, somehow Fitz became the bass player. Our drummer for
Slash looks weird. See him in the videos playing bass.
I know, right? He picks up the bass, and I think mostly because we wanted to involve Shane, our drummer, who, again, I've known for like 30 years. So we've all known each other forever. We used to play the same Canadian circuit where you'd play 5-6 nights a week. We all knew each other from back then. And Shane plays with a group. Well, he did play with a group called the Bees from Japan. And they play like the Tokyo Dome like 6 nights in a row, like 60,000 people a night or some crazy thing. And I was like, what? And then he played with Yngwie and Michael Schenker and all these crazy things. So he's one of those guys. He was actually the first guy that I knew that, like, Shane Gallus moved to Los Angeles. What? And then Corey eventually moved down because of the Shania gig. And then Fitz moved down. So it was kind of like they were all these guys I knew who had all relocated to the States. So it wasn't until, I didn't come down here until 2000. Well, I was kind of in and out around 2003, but I didn't really come sort of more fully till the end of 2006, 2007. So, and in doing that, it's like, it's just this bizarre thing of being, it's the same as the Brits, it's like you go over to my British friends' houses, Union Jacks, the Clash is cranked up. I get it. You're English. We know.
Yeah.
We know. Like they're like, gotta let everybody know. And I go to my Canadian friends' houses. It's the same thing. Big Canadian flag, lover boy or something. And I go, I get it. You're Canadian. There's nobody more patriotic than the expat. You know what I mean? Like, and that's kind of largely what ended up happening. So it was a really weird turn of events that we just started playing these Canadian shows, playing this Canadian music, started recording some of our favorite songs. The next thing you know, it's kind of like, well, let's put it out. We put out one record. The second one, we sort of, Corey came over to my place and we came up with this song, Never Enough for You. And we finished it at his house.
Dude, probably one of the best original rock songs I've heard in a long time.
Oh, that's awesome.
Sure.
Thank you. I really mean that. That really means a lot. It's funny because of the nature of this Canadian music that we've been playing, we kind of felt like guided by the idea of, well, it has to kind of fit in with the kind of music we've been playing. Otherwise, it's going to be this kind of like, not only is it Canadian, it's actually specific. A friend of mine pointed out to me, he goes, you realize that you're playing the music that Toque focuses on is from a very specific, like 5-year period. And I go, I never thought of it that way. But of course it is, because that's when you're the most, you're just a fucking sponge, like the music you love. And so all the music that we loved was from this specific period,
That must make it like extra personal and give you like a good
exactly.
feeling.
And I mean, and a lot of the bands that we're playing are all bands that we went to see in our first few, your early days of like, I want to do what they're doing. This is a rock star right here, and a lot of them didn't translate beyond Canada. So it's sometimes can be quite detrimental to your career to not have anything beyond Canada. But, my biggest thing was like, wouldn't it be cool if some person in South America or Japan said, this is my favorite song from your album. And it's the song that there's no way they would have heard this song if we didn't record it. And that has happened like tenfold where people will go, I love this song. And I go, people, not only do people, it's not just a regional thing, it's actually generational. Like, it's like, there's people in Canada who don't know some of the songs we play because they are from the early 80s or something like that. So
such a great idea.
It was just mostly for fun, and then when it came time to like produce this original song, Corey got super crazy with the keyboards and stuff like that. And I was kind of like, go for it, dude. It has to kind of sound like Toque, because Toque has been doing this stuff, a lot of keyboards, a lot of, an 80s sort of polish to it that we kind of, and I like being able to do that, where I have a project that does this and another project that does that, and then this one. So I kind of get to scratch a lot of itches, a lot of things that I like to do. The only thing I don't really have is like some super heavy project. And I've always wanted to do that at some point, but I have too many things on the go as it is.
I'll grab one last question from you, then I'll let you go.
Sure.
You get to play alongside Bruce Kulick now, doing Kiss songs, Slash doing Guns N' Roses. You played with Faster Pussycat, obviously. What do you think the young Todd Kerns would think if you were able to tell him when he was first picking up a guitar?
Yeah, that's funny that you say that. No one's actually brought it up that way. Very clever, Rob. That actually is interesting, because the Bruce Kulick thing I think of a lot, because Bruce, I love him to death. I've known him for years, but every once in a while I'll have this conversation, like with somebody, this girl I know who's from the same area sent me photos from the show we saw, like the show, not the tour, but the show. And I sent it to Bruce one day. I go, here's the first time we met. And it's like literally him on stage with the guys and the crowd. I go, I'm somewhere in there, So that is, and then like I say, I've done, the first concert I ever saw was Bryan Adams opening for Loverboy. I know the Loverboy guys, like they're like awesome dudes. And you're like, I think once in a while, I've played the very room that I saw that concert in, you know what I mean?
Wow.
With Slash, we went back, and it was like this moment of like, I was on stage doing sound check, and it took me a second to go, because the name of the building had been changed to some corporate, whatever corporate
sponsorship
as they do,
thing, whatever's going on.
Exactly, yeah. So and I was like, oh, this used to be the Centennial Auditorium. I had this moment, I was like, dude, I sat right there and watched my very first concert. And it just I had a lot of those experiences with Slash, where I'd go to, even playing the Roxy in Los Angeles and Hollywood. I mean, Age of Electric, we went down to LA in 91, and we did like showcases at the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Roxy. So all these years later, to go back into those rooms, even after all that had happened, and I'd moved back to Canada, or that after the Age of Electric split up, there was a part of me that thought like, well, I had those experiences. I'll probably never play those places again. Who knows? And then years later, I'm on that very stage with Slash, and then in a couple of other times I've been at the Whiskey Go and the Roxy. And it's just this surreal experience of like it just like things change, but they really kind of stay the same. Once in a while, I remember saying to and I thought of it recently. I remember saying when I was younger, I go, I don't necessarily need a Grammy. I don't necessarily need a gazillion dollars. I just want to play music. And once in a while, you'll kind of get on yourself, because I watched this David Foster documentary the other day, and he's got like 1 million Grammys on top of his piano. And you're like, wow. I just went like, it just blows my mind, because that's never been a motivating factor to me. Like, not that I don't care. Of course, anybody would love to be given an award. There's a star with my name on it in Vancouver on the street. And that's like a massive thing that I never expected to ever happen. It's one of those things that's so surreal that you can't even wrap your head around it. So for me, it's like, I bet you I'm next to David Foster, actually. I'm sure there goes the neighborhood. But I think that, to me, it's like I am doing exactly what I set out to do. I play music. I have a life doing it. I don't need a private jet, all that stuff. It's like, I just don't, I couldn't be bothered. I just want to play music. And I feel fortunate every single day that someone calls me and goes, hey, you want to go and just today, my friend's like, come sing on this song. We're going to shoot a video. And I'm like, hell yeah. It's like, they're not like some massive, signed act. It's just like my friends. And that's kind of how I'm always sort of wired, is just like, that sounds like fun, and that's really what it comes down to, is it's like, you find yourself in a position to be lucky enough to go, if something doesn't sound like fun, you go, nah, but largely, I set out to be a musician and do it for my life, and that's what I do. I plan to do it as long as I can. Ringo Starr just turned 80 the other day, and that's the new touchstone. You know what I mean? Like that's the new touchstone that I go, because you remember like when you were like, ooh, like Tony Bennett's like 95 and he's still playing shows, and you're like, there was a time where you thought like 50, 60, what? That's now you think to yourself like Rick Springfield turned 70, and I was like, I looked at him, I go, that man is 70 years old. It just blows your mind.
I think there gets to be like a cutoff point at some time when you kind of clawing for the success. You're like, right, I got to make it by I'm 25. You get to 25, right? Give it another 5 years. Then you get to about 35, and then you kind of, oh, screw it, I'm enjoying it too much. Just keep going.
Yeah, exactly. My father said that when I was a kid. He goes, when I'd actually started to pursue it as a career, because where I came from, that sounded like, I may as well have said, I'm going to get a unicorn and I'm going to go, fight dragons. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? But they were, cool enough to go, yeah, okay. But I remember saying, yeah, that okay. Then at 25, you take a look around, see what you're doing. My father's such a, sensible man that way. And then you decide what you want to do from there. I go, okay. And then at 25, I remember I didn't think of this because that what he said didn't matter to me. I was like, I'm going to do this anyway. But I remember around 25, he was like, well, you're doing well. So, I guess just keep doing it. And I remember thinking, so every once in a while you stop and you take a look around and you go, I'm doing this. Everything seems fine. It's like, kind of at any point expect someone to tap you on the shoulder and go, thank you for your time. Just sit this next play out. But until that happens, it's just like, I always like at the end of there was a silly movie about Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire, which wasn't a particularly great movie. But I remember at the end of the movie, it had this line that said something like, they always have that sort of post-movie, this happened and that happened. And it said, and Jerry Lee Lewis is playing somewhere tonight.
That's a great.
And I remember thinking like, that's all I want is for someone to say Todd Kerns is playing somewhere tonight. So it is important to me that, just that I'll always be doing this. And, and like, until I can't, just physically can't, do it anymore. Or until my wife just says, you look ridiculous.
It's easy to see that you do still genuinely enjoy it.
Oh, well, I'm glad that's translating.
Thank you ever so much for doing this, mate. I'll let you go.
Thank you, brother. That was a lot of fun.
Hopefully I'll see you soon. Hopefully.
Absolutely. I'm hoping 2021 to be somewhere in your neighborhood for sure. Say hi to the gang for me.
I will, man. All right. Lovely to see you, Todd.
You too.
Take care, mate.
Bye-bye.
How great is that song? Like, for reals. Hope you enjoyed that, and also my chat with Todd. It was very cool to catch up with him, and I really hope live music can get back on its feet soon so he can get back out there doing what he truly loves. Thanks for continuing to support this podcast and for all your great messages on Facebook and all the likes, shares and follows. I'm hoping to get a proper website up and running soon with all contact info and some extra cool stuff, so I'll keep you in the loop on that. But for now, I just love that you're enjoying this, and whilst you are, I'll continue to put them out. So until next time, I've been your host, Rob Lane. This has been the Straight to Video podcast. Please look after yourselves and take care.